All right, folks, welcome back to another episode. We're calling this Alaska Election Talk. We have to figure out a name for the show, but we're gonna get there eventually. Very excited this week to be joined by Matt Shuckerow from Fathom Strategic Communication.
Yep, thanks for having me on.
Former campaign manager for Dan Sullivan and former press secretary for Mike Dunleavy.
That's right.
And Scott Kendall from Cashian Gilmore Lindemuth, lawyer, former chief of staff for Governor Bill Walker, and also a campaign manager for Lisa Murkowski.
Yeah.
We were having a bit of a resume off here before we started. Well, I'm glad you guys are here. There's a lot to talk about. We have obviously the big elections coming up this year, the governor's race, the Lisa Murkowski race, and then the open congressional race. And I want to start off with the governor's race. I'm going to start with you, Matt. The governor hasn't picked a running mate yet. Under the new election system, they don't run separately, lieutenant governor and governor. The governor picks the running mate. It's already almost mid-April, and it's got to be June 1st. A lot of speculation out there. Do you have any thoughts on why he hasn't chosen a running mate yet?
You know, I think that's interesting, and I've talked to a lot of people about this. I think the conventional wisdom seems to be you declare, you and your running mate get in, and you start fundraising. You get two people, you can hit the road. But this is the first time we're doing it this way, and so I do point to people. In the United States, when we elect our president, they don't pick their vice president until August. I mean, it's not a foreign concept that we kind of wait. And I think people understand there may be waiting and deciding and seeing what kind of fits the politics of the time, seeing what the field looks like. So, again, this is the first time we're doing it this way, and so it's not like he's breaking a mold. There really isn't a mold. And for him to wait a little bit and see what the field looks like, it's not, in my mind, it's not that crazy. I think that there's plenty of time. Obviously, he has to pick before June 1st, but I would also say that there's a lot of attention focused on in the political arena on obviously the special election, on what's happening down in Juneau with the budget and with all the things that are going on. So I still think there's time. I think that they're probably,
he's got the hard deadline of June 1st. Yes.
Yeah.
Decide by that. I mean, Scott, you're a Bill Walker supporter. You worked for Bill Walker as chief of staff. He came out of the gate with Heidi Drygas, his former labor commissioner. What are your thoughts about the governor? Is it strategic, or is it good or bad to wait so long?
Yeah, I don't. It might surprise you to know he hasn't confided in me about his process. But
yeah, you guys talking about it?
But what's what's interesting, under the old rules, before the campaign finance limits just blew up, you always had to get someone in December so you could get that get the annual money twice. But with that out of the way, I don't know what's strategic at this point. I mean, it's very, it's unusual, right? He is the incumbent. You'd think he'd have someone lined up. I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to run with him.
They're lining up.
Right. I'm sure there's people.
I've heard from many of them.
Yeah, they're petitioning him, but he's got a tall order. I mean, if you look, whatever you think of folks' politics, Heidi Drygas is an impressive lieutenant governor. Her resume, her charisma, that's tough. And, who the person is replacing, Kevin Meyer, I don't know the person who doesn't like Kevin Meyer, but I have real questions about him. He's just one of the most likable, low-key public servants you'd think, that's your perfect sidekick. So how do you replace that? How do you replicate that? And I don't know if he's trying to replicate it, but it's a tall order.
And there's been some speculation about why Kevin, if it was his choice or somebody else's choice. But, I mean, Matt, to me, Kevin's like the ideal. He doesn't want to be governor. He's a good team player. He's been super involved in the issues, the tourism issues, and he's a longtime legislator, knows how the process works. I mean, he seems to be like the ideal lieutenant governor.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question Kevin Meyer is one of the most respected people in and out of that building, and has been for many years, and has served in the assembly and served in the legislature, and now as lieutenant governor. But I think that there's also, I think as we look at it, I think that any candidate benefits from someone who can, who can pound pavement, who can run and go out there and speak and connect with people. I mean, I think if I were a candidate, obviously you're looking for someone who can engage with new groups. And, the calculus is what is advantageous. We've worked in politics. Is it geographic? Is it certain groups? Is it coalitions? So there's all these things that you're weighing. And I think that, like I said, obviously there's still time left, and I think the congressional special kind of throws that even more into mix. Now, maybe the governor was on the path to making an announcement, but now that we have 48 people running for Congress, some of whom perhaps could have been under consideration for lieutenant governor, who knows? But I think it does delay a little bit that conversation of maybe someone was about to be announced in the not too distant future. But now all the focus is obviously on the congressional race.
Right.
One thing I've heard, and again, it's speculation, but it is out there, that the governor might be talking to several legislators, more than 2, more than 3, about maybe being the running mate. And maybe the calculus is, well, these big votes are coming up here on the budget and the conference committee. And maybe it's a strategic move to, well, if I'm going to be the running mate, maybe I should, vote a certain way. Is that any credibility there, Scott? Or
I've heard that. Yeah, I mean, I've heard a little of that, but I mean, I've heard a little of everything at this point, right? But there's a certain logic to that. I mean, especially if, there's only so many political figures in the state. So maybe he's talked to 2 or 3 of them. Would you really want to spurn someone right before critical votes? I sure wouldn't. But that's kind of, where he is in the process. Because if you look at it, the election will be a referendum on Mike Dunleavy, regardless of who he chooses. He's a big personality. He's made a splash over the last 3 years. And so he's got to be in a mode where he's like, first, do no harm, right? Because, you think about the triangulation of, if I get someone from Fairbanks, I get someone from the Kenai, trying to spread out your base of support. But the number one criteria is going to be, who did you upset by your choice? And do people look at that person and think, the number one role of the lieutenant governor, in addition to elections and the state seal, is, they're one heartbeat away from being governor.
that's what I was going to say. The number one criteria should
Right.
be, I think we saw this with John McCain and Sarah Palin back in 2008, is, can that person become governor
Right.
if something happens?
And if you pick the wrong person and they implode, your campaign implodes.
But I think the conventional wisdom here, in some, is the previous process was you got married without, it was someone that you never went on a date with necessarily. They got married to you.
Forced,
Yeah,
arranged marriage.
It was
Arranged marriage.
love is blind. But now you do get to have a courting, and you get to kind of figure it out, and you get to negotiate a little bit. So again, I'm sure that Governor Walker and Heidi Dragas had a lot of these conversations. I'm sure candidates across the spectrum are having these conversations. So, I'm sure it's a tough conversation to have under a new dynamic, and there's politics involved, of course.
Speaking of that, Edie Grunwald was one of the 6 people who ran for lieutenant governor in 2018.
She came close, too.
And she was second.
Yeah.
And Len Gaddis was in there. Obviously, Kevin Meyer won. And now Edie Grunwald. I want to talk about some of these other candidates. The field for governor, I actually thought would grow. And right now, it's basically stayed where it is. There's about 7 or 8. Everybody hasn't filed on Division of Elections, but there's a Kirka, January 6th guy from Homer, Huper, I think. There's Charlie Pierce from the Kenai, the mayor, with Edie Grunwald. And there's some other people, Bruce Walden and Tanya Lang, they're kind of less known. And then Les Guerra, Democrat, with the teacher he's running with, and then Bill Walker with Heidi. Do you guys see more people potentially? I mean, like I said, a month and a half, and is the field set, or do you think anybody else might jump in?
I mean, the question is, does anyone else legitimate jump in, right? Because there's only
legitimate, yeah.
Right, there's only so many lanes, and I think what you see from that group is the lanes are pretty well filled. I mean, in terms of far right, less far right, middle, left. Is there going to be an impetus for someone to get in, and why are they getting in at that point?
I think he might have just placed Dunleavy in the moderate category.
Who's moderate?
Well, I will say Dunleavy.
I mean, he's definitely on the other side of Kirka and Pierce.
Right, and that's the
More
interesting
towards the
dynamic,
center.
right? So both the geography and the politics. So Dunleavy, and someone can check my math, but I think he lost or tied every region of the state but the Kenai and the Mat-Su, and then ran up the score there, and that's how you run away with the election. He's got a candidate in each of those bases of support now, so that's the geography challenge. But the political challenge, I mean, we all saw that video of the governor out in the Mat-Su, and they're screaming at him to fire Ann Zink, right? Some of us think like not everyone agreed with everything he did. I mean, I've been a critic, but I'll say on COVID, I thought he got a passing grade. He it waxed and waned, but he put, Ann Zink's a professional, and science guided a lot of those early decisions, but that puts him at odds with some of these folks on his right. So when I put him, to the middle of Kirka, I mean, I think that's clear that that's where he is.
As you said, it's a new system. We have this top 4 deal, and then the ranked choice. And I mean, I've thought a lot about who are the top 4 going to be, and I know the top 4 are really going to dictate who can win and who can't win.
Yeah.
If it's 2 Republicans or 3 Republicans, and Walker or Gare. I mean, Gare, I assume Gare is going to go as a Democrat. He's going to get so many Democratic votes. And have you thought about this kind of dynamics of who the top four are going to be?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that I've referenced the 2016 Senate race where we had Ray Metcalf and Margaret Stock and Senator Murkowski and Joe Miller as kind of a take a look. We've seen what a top four can look like. We've seen what vote totals look like. We've seen what could be a breakdown, and it's interesting to examine that as where do people fall. So, I mean, if it were me, I would probably say that it's accurate to say that it's going to be a Guerra and a Walker and a Dunleavy, and then possibly one of the other two, so a Kirka or
probably a Kirka or a Pierce.
That's right. And I mean, I'd be leaning towards. I would imagine Pierce has an advantage on that because he's kind of a little bit more perhaps mainstream than Kirka. But so then what happens after that? And there's a lot of folks who are looking into this and how often do people vote on the ranked choice system? Do they vote for a second candidate, and do they continue down the list? And a lot of things I've looked at is if there's a candidate that is similar to your ideology, then you're far more likely to pick a second candidate. So if a Pierce voter is going into the ballot box on election day, they may also pick a Dunleavy, vice versa. But they may not be crossing over to a Walker or a Guerra, and vice versa, I think, on the other side. So it's going to be very, very fascinating. I think a lot of people are looking into this and trying to study up and see what works.
Scott, what is, I mean, Bill Walker supporter, what's Bill's path when, he does the dividend thing is stuck to him. He dropped out of the last race right at the end after the filing deadline. What's his path to make it work?
And for starters, I'll say I don't think Matt is either. I'm not affiliated with any of the governor's campaigns, governor's race campaigns.
Right, but I mean, you're a Walker number one.
Yeah, no,
voter.
For sure. I mean, Bill and Heidi are personal friends. I think they're incredibly qualified, and I think you're right to raise a couple of these issues. I mean, the dividend issue is a divisive issue, but it's also, look where we're at. Through the recall or otherwise, how different does this current budget and the dividends we're paying out, how different does that look versus what Bill Walker was doing? I think, the leadership Bill Walker showed in his term, I think has loomed over the 3 years of Dunleavy's term. We've never broken the POMV formula. Everyone keeps saying, "Oh, that's advisory." We don't, but
well, he did the veto in 16,
right,
which got all the attention and is still on the radar of a lot of people. But then every year since then, the legislature has set a kind of, de facto amount, whatever they kind of a fiat amount, whatever they choose.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people still look at Walker for it, but not maybe necessarily say the legislature has been the ones since 2016 who has set it at a smaller amount.
No governor has the checkbook, right? I mean, if Mike Dunleavy had a checkbook, he would have. I think he would have written everyone a $7,000 check. He can't do it. He's the only governor who's vetoed the entire dividend, for that matter. He did it, and then got back the exact dividend he vetoed. So there's so much churn around the issue. I almost feel as though, there are several lanes of travel here, right? There are the full PFD, follow a statute, no matter what. That lane has narrowed. I think even Governor Dunleavy is not saying, let's follow the statute.
He's gone to the 50.
He's moved kind of halfway in between where Bill Walker was, and it's a matter of what we can afford.
And I'll say that, I mean, I worked for him, and it was, having talked to him, a lot of this was follow it until we fix it, and that we're at the till we fix it place. I mean, I think a lot of people, I haven't seen polling, but I think a lot of people would agree that the constant infighting, the years of acrimony that have lasted for far too long, people do want to solve it. And in some ways, I'll give a little credit to the governor, because the only way to solve it, because it's been ruled by the courts that it essentially right now it is an appropriation. What happens that we don't solve it until there's a lasting solution. Now, again, I know that is challenging. I think people are nervous on what that looks like. So. To Scott's point, the conversation has moved a long way.
I haven't seen polling recently, but I just get the sense of it that people are so tired of every year the fight. What's it going to be? Is it going to be 1,000 or 3,000 or 2,000 or 1,800? I think people are generally just they'd be okay with a smaller amount if they just knew what the amount was going to be and it was predictable.
Yeah.
Instead of this every year, the House passes a bill, an amount, the Senate passes an amount, the governor's saying something else, and they see the headlines, but nobody really knows what it's going to be. Even I don't even know, and I'm pretty much living inside Juneau, and every day it seems like it's going to be a different amount.
And it's not just the uncertainty, right? It's the dysfunction that spills out of it. I mean, what is the number one issue? What drives everything? Amendment after amendment after amendment on the dividend. And I think you're right. What else is the legislature getting done? And that's not a critique of the legislature, but that's these forces that tug them back and forth on the dividend. I don't think anyone thinks it's productive. And I have seen polling which puts people, it's all over the map from that full dividend, no matter what group, I think has shrunk in the sense of, pragmatism. At some point, it hasn't happened for 5 years. We need to move on as a state. There is a significant and growing group that want no dividend. I'm not in that group. I don't think a lot of people are, but there is a group of people who are like, holy cow.
Well, there's definitely a group of people, of business type people or of higher income folks who say, we shouldn't be taxing people to pay the larger dividend. And this has been a question that's, been on.
Well, I'd say, and then there's a group of people who just want to end the fight, right? And the problem
probably
is
the biggest group.
We have never, there's probably, and there's not agreement on what ending the fight looks like. I mean, there's some people who say in order to end the fight, it has to be done this way because it is an appropriation. So you're right. I think one of the biggest groups is end the fight, but the funny part is there's such disagreement on what ending the fight looks like that we're still here.
But the good news, I mean, I guess, if I could extract good news from the chaos, which is, we've had this radical fight on the budget. Everyone remembers summer of 2019. That was bananas. We had special sessions in Wasilla. We had people in Juneau.
That's where I rented the RV, and I had the vision of having the tailgate, do the podcast, hang out at the RV. Nobody came to my RV. like literally nobody came over.
I don't blame them. But the point is, I think within a high degree of certainty, we kind of know what the budget is, right? We're not cutting the budget 40%. All that talk has fallen away. The other thing that's really positive is we didn't, to me, maybe others disagree, but we didn't overdraw the permanent fund. We didn't break the fund. The fund's $7-8 billion bigger than it would have been because of the money kept in, and then not appropriating out. So it's big and it's growing. We haven't broken the rules, so we have the tools because everyone who looks at the state budget closely enough knows that if we broke that tool, we don't have enough people, enough tax base. We couldn't fix the budget after that. That is a huge chunk of the solution.
We're here again where the price of oil has gone up to over 100 for the last month since this Ukraine thing. Russia invaded Ukraine, and where the budget's ballooned quite a bit with this $1,300 one-time rebate for it's $800 and some million. I want to move on, though. I want to talk about the U.S. Senate race.
Sure.
Right now, there's 11 people that have officially filed. L.V. Gray Jackson, the only Democrat, got out of the race to run for the state Senate. There's a bunch of kind of frequent flyers: David Darden, Dustin Darden, Sidney Hill, Hunky Lee. That's one of my.
Hunky Lee is a frequent flyer.
Hunky's my guy from the. He's big karaoke for all of our live streams. So far, there's not a Democrat on the ballot. Not even one of the fringy Democrats. There's Murkowski, Chewbacca, which are kind of the big ones, and then a bunch of other people. And this has gotten some attention nationally. I want to play a clip here from Bill Maher from 2 weeks ago on his show. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but let's cue this up, and you guys can take a look.
Alaska Senate candidate Kelly Chewbacca speaks in tongues, otherwise known as jabbering senselessly. This is her. Take a listen.
La yada yada said yada po manaya Adelina yada ka.
Pathetic. Pathetic. Like the people of Alaska would even vote for some dim-witted religious nut.
Classic Palin, but I mean, for now, it's on Bill Maher there. But Chewbacca is really the main opponent of Murkowski, and again, it's going to matter on the top four. But I mean, you worked with her when you were working for the governor. Well, I mean, what do you? She's been endorsed by the Republican Party, endorsed by Donald Trump, but it's not a Republican primary. So, what's her path?
Well, look, I would just say, just generally speaking on the U.S. Senate race, that the things that I look at, and I've run a U.S. Senate race. I ran Senator Sullivan's campaign in 2020. It's
you did the famous clothesline when they tried to.
Someone recently
caribou heart.
Oh, I remember
we should have teed that up as well, but
we should have. That's on. We got the video. Put it on. I think it got like 100,000 hits on YouTube.
That's good staff work.
That was really good.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that. And Jeff actually made a funny video out of that. But
Slow motion, repeat.
Importantly, I think it's cash on hand, it's momentum, it's coalitions. This is if in the campaign that I ran, it's fundraising, it's coalitions, it's grassroots, and it's getting organized and doing what you need to do when it's down the road when it comes to chasing ballots, identifying voters, making sure your digital program is all together. So when I look at the election, and we will have more insight when we look at the FEC disclosures for that race, Senator Murkowski is going to have well over $5.5 or $6 million.
Last time she was, I think, over 4, and Chewbacca hadn't even hit $1 million, and she had spent a lot too.
Yeah, and I think the last I looked, Kelly Chewbacca is going to have somewhere around $500,000. That's a really tall hurdle to tackle, and I think that Senator Murkowski has always kind of generally been a very good fundraiser, and in part because she fights really hard on some of these important issues she cares about. But the other thing too, I think on campaign side of things, we have to look at what the calendar looks like. I will flag that there's a big Republican Party convention, and I know
Fairbanks in a few weeks.
Fairbanks, yeah, and the RNC chairwoman is coming up for that, and there's going to be speeches, and so we'll see what happens there. But I think so much attention has been placed on this congressional race now that they've kind of moved the attention, and I will say I've heard from some folks who were maybe energized from the Murkowski side, but also from the Chewbacca side, energized in the race, and that energy has been shifted to the congressional race because that's where the attention is, that's where the new action is, that's where there's a likelihood that something can happen.
But even before that, Elvie Gray Jackson was the only Democrat. Right. And now, have the Democrats kind of given up on this race? They just said we're not going to even worry about it?
I think a Democrat will be in. Obviously, anyone who gets in between now and June 1st, boy, you're behind in fundraising, you're behind in coalition building. But that sort of frames up the race, right? Because look at Don Young's success, just to kind of pivot over there for a minute. He said, sometimes outrageous things, but had a heart of gold, and there weren't many Alaskans whose lives hadn't been touched by something he'd done. I think more than anything, that's, the cash on hand is big because it shows the work you're doing, all those things. But look at the scope of Senator Murkowski's work. How many people haven't been touched by something she's done, some sort of piece of infrastructure, some legislation, some vote. There's opportunities, of course, to upset people. Don Young did it too, but that depth of relationships, Alaska's very relational, right? We saw that in Lisa's write-in election. It's just more than party label. So, as I see it, she kind of sits in the catbird seat, currently.
Well, and I'll say this, one thing, we're used to having incumbents and seeing the challengers, but my advice to any challenger is you obviously people take different tacks, but too often we don't talk about enough the things they want to do different and how they're going to be marginally different. Oftentimes we see candidates talking about the exact same issue, and even when I was running Sullivan's race, Al Gross would attack the senator on certain issues, and we would kind of internally laugh a little because we would say, does he know that we're actually big leaders on these issues? That these are like if he were to see the depth of work that he's done, but so. Sometimes all attacks, obviously you got to make a difference, you got to build name rec, but there's for far too long, a lot of people haven't been talking about what they want to do or how they want to be different. So I would hope that people spend a little more time on that.
Is there a situation where if it's Murkowski, Chewbacca, and one other Republican, or maybe one other Republican, one other kind of conservative, because there's no Democrats in the race right now, depending on the top 4 who advance, is there a situation where the general becomes essentially a mini Republican primary with a lot of Republicans on the ballot, for the 3 or 4 people, and then Murkowski suffers from that? Is that a possibility?
Well, everyone votes, so you got to think about it.
But some of the people might not rank a second person or a third person if they feel very, if they feel strongly against somebody.
Yeah.
I think the conventional wisdom is if Murkowski and Chewbacca go, and then you have a couple other people who are center or maybe on, progressive leaning or left leaning, they'll pick up all the second votes. But I'm just wondering if it's all Republicans who advance, if there's no Democrat on the ballot, could there be a situation where that really creates a bad potential outcome for her?
Well, only about 13% of voters are Democrats. More leaners, just like with Republicans being 23 or 24%. But keep in mind, this is going to be a very high turnout election. Everyone's showing up. It's not going to be the 80,000 people you typically see in a primary. It's going to be the 300,000 that you see in a general. And they're all going to choose someone on there. And so I think they'll all be fighting for those same votes. I don't see downside. You know, the system, the ranked choice system is built to take in a whole spectrum, and typically that's what you see. It's entirely possible. I'll be surprised if there's not a Democrat on the ballot. I really will. I mean, even when Lisa ran in 2016, we had Ray Metcalf on the ballot. You know, he was the recognized Democrat.
Disco Ray.
Disco Ray.
Who used to be a Republican.
Who used to be a Republican
way,
and then started, I think, the moderate Republican Party of Alaska and then went Democrat. And of course, Margaret Stock, in that election at least, was really kind of the Democratic Party's preferred choice. She was the one who had their official support, even though she couldn't appear as that on the ballot. But even when you took those two candidates and you added up their support, it was, I think, something like 23, 24%, and Lisa had, the 41.
End of the day, Murkowski, like you said, Matt, is going to have millions and millions of dollars, and the other candidates are going to probably combined have way less than her, combine all the other ones.
Well, and I would say it's not, and it's to Scott's point, it's not just money. I think she has done a good job on coalitions and bringing people together. But I'll say this. I don't think any campaign should take anything for granted. Particularly now, we're going to see big infusion of interest in Alaska. I mean, I've talked to a number of the rating agencies, the folks who are watching this race, just checking in contacts from previous years. And they're going to be keeping a close eye on this, and they're very, very fascinated to see what's happening. So I would say I can't imagine anyone's taking this race for granted, regardless of how much money is there. The thing I'll point to is, as you guys recall, in the 2020 race, Al Gross raised $15 million practically overnight, and it shows what can happen, and you have to be prepared for any race, for anything. And that was nothing, to be honest, it was very little to do about Al Gross. That was in the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and they came together with this big pact to jointly raise money. And I
think he also got some support from the National Democrats, and the money was pouring into his campaign. Right. I think it surprised a lot of us. He was kind of his dad was an attorney general, but really nobody really knew who he was before that election. Now, and we'll go on to the House.
But Matt's points, I mean, that's the really important point is with lower 48 kind of like mass fundraising and super PACs, the complexion of all of a sudden Al Gross had 2-to-1 money advantage on Dan Sullivan. So that can happen overnight. So which is why, I'm sure Senator Murkowski's team is not going to let up for a second, because you just don't know.
And I will say it's going to be very fascinating when you make your buys, how much you dedicate to a primary, where you hold your resources and when you spend them. As we saw last year, everyone hated all the stuff on YouTube and on OTT, digital Hulu, but that was the only place you could buy, and that's why those airwaves, the digital airwaves, were flooded to the point of annoyance. We would get funny calls from parents who are like, "My kids, they're mad. Their YouTube, their iPads are taken over with Bear Doctor, Bear Doctor."
It was everywhere. I mean,
my kids still sing Bear Doctor, not in glowing terms, but I mean that's the point. Is I think Matt and I both worked with outside funders. They come in and at some point late in a race they'll say, "Well, what can you do with $3 million more?" And you'll say, "There are not more faces that I can put an ad in front of."
Speaking of which, folks, if you're watching and you have some of these dollars and you want to advertise on the Alaska Landmine, our show here or the website, you need to get a hold of me, because we have plenty of ad space available. And I do want to real quick thank GCI for being one of our main sponsors and making live streams like this possible. Big shout out to GCI for being one of our main sponsors. You talking about Al Gross, I want to talk about the special primary here. We have 48 people, and it's already kind of starting. I heard last night Tara Sweeney had an event at Hugh Ashlock's house. Josh Revak's having one this week at John Morris, the former homeless coordinator. He's having an event there. Adam Wool's out there campaigning with some artwork. We talked about it last week. We had Art Hackney and Kim Jones and Austin Baird talking about just that election. But I guess what is the way the ballot's got in a few weeks. How do people campaign? I think Palin and Gross I just feel like they're going to make it. So there's 2 more spots left.
I don't think anything's certain, because it's a wide field, which I think was to be expected. But what's different about it is I think there are 8-9 serious candidates out of that 48. I mean, there's obviously people who have very little chance.
Let's not discount Santa Claus.
I mean, he's going to get more votes. He's going to be in the top 7 or 8, just on the. I think he will, just on the name. But when you put that aside, everyone sort of assumes Al Gross is in, Sarah Palin's in. I don't know if you can assume that, because you have to think of this election as there are certain pies.
Because
right?
you need so few votes to.
But think about it though. There's only so many Republican votes in that pie. There's only so many Democratic votes in this pie, and no one's crossing over. There's not Republicans dying to vote for Al Gross because they heard the Bear Doctor song, and there's not Democrats who are dying to vote for Sarah Palin because they remember, So name ID doesn't equal support necessarily. So I think you're right. They have a leg up.
Don't some of the worst people? Everybody says, oh, they're done. They're horrible, but people know who they are, so they inevitably all of these people you think are always going to lose end up winning.
I'm not opining on whether they're good candidates or bad candidates. I'm just saying they're people with very high name ID that also, hand in hand with that, have very high negatives. So a lot of people know you, but a lot of people are also not voting for you. And what about if one of these fresh new faces, gets enough money to get name ID and tell a story? I think one of them
don't have very much time to Matt.
Well, so I was going to say, we know ballots are going out in not too long from now. If you go to the Division of Elections, they have their timeline. Ballots go out.
First week of May, people have ballots.
April 27th, they'll be
out.
sent. So people are going to have ballots in their mailboxes ready to go.
Almost 600,000 ballots are going out in the mail.
Yeah, and so the big question, I'm of the camp that it is a little bit of a jump ball because it's a turnout race. So many campaigns right now are trying to examine, and it's really hard because the data's not really there. How many votes can we expect? Every campaign that's ever run, you have a vote total and a vote goal, and you're trying to reach it. Setting a vote total this election is going to be really challenging. I was pulling the numbers today. For the most part, the highest turnout for primaries is it doesn't exceed 40%. We had 39% in 2014, 33%. In 2010. In 2006, 2008, we had just around 40%. So it's those sort of things, but can we match that? And then in a general, we have 60%, 66% last in 2020. But I think that's the max, and when you really think about it, it's can you target a group of people to get your piece of the pie to advance? And the conventional wisdom of campaigns, everyone views campaigns under different lenses, but there's a lot of people that I respect. Their philosophy is always worry about the race in front of you. And there's some candidates I personally think would probably have a better likelihood in a 4-person layout. There's also people who have a better chance of advancing to a top 4 that maybe don't fit in that don't necessarily have the best chances in the final. So
no one knows what the denominator is, right? 100,000 people could show up, 250,000 people could show up.
We talked about it last week, and I kind of looked at some of the numbers you were looking at, and it's summertime, it's special, but they are going to be in the mail, so does that mean more people are going to vote, or are people going to say, screw it, there's so much going on, 48 people, I'll just wait till the next. But if it's 150,000, right? I mean, some 40 people are going to consume, some percentage of the vote, 20% of the vote, for example. They're going to get 0.5% or 1%. So then you have this big chunk left for the 10 people that are maybe the more serious ones. And in that scenario, even if it's 200,000, you don't need that many votes. Yeah. Compared to,
but you got to find them, and you got to get them, and you got to turn them out, and so
your point is fair. If you assume 150,000, then you essentially need 32,500 votes. I mean, and you're okay. And where
maybe less than that.
Well, of course, but like in the best case scenario, if you reach this threshold, you should be okay. And this is very fascinating because there's going to be likely a municipal election happening by mail at the same time.
Right. So
downtown. So people are going to be talking about
downtown Anchorage, the 12th.
Downtown Anchorage. And so are people focused on that? Do those districts, which are bigger than our legislative districts, does that drive turnout? And how do people perform in Anchorage? I mean, Anchorage is a very fascinating town. There's some people that have built-in constituencies. Do those people come to the polls in a big way to support their hometown type of person? I mean, there's a lot of folks here. The Tara Sweeney, she has a built-in constituency. She is very representative of the Alaska Native and the business community. Josh Reback has a built-in constituency. He represents essentially 40,000 people in Anchorage. There's these other people that have constituencies, and can you drive them out? But I'll tell you what, vote by mail. If I were candidates, I would be looking towards states like Colorado or Oregon, who've been doing vote by mail for a long time.
Right.
And I've talked to Republicans in Colorado who are saying we can win in vote by mail. We just have to outperform. And I'll tell people now, because it's a vote by mail in the primary, I would expect people are going to try to communicate with you by mail.
Well, I want to be chasing those ballots with their piece.
Yeah. I want to ask both of you. I mean, Republicans have not everybody, but generally have been against vote by mail on the local here Anchorage election. Nationally, we saw with the last 2020 election with COVID, and now we have a Republican governor and lieutenant governor Kevin Meyer, who's running the election, who are doing a vote by mail election only because there wasn't enough time to put people at the polls and get adequate poll facilities and poll workers. But I mean, is there going to be, depending on the results and who doesn't make it and who makes it, is there going to be a big questioning of this election afterwards? And they're going to say, oh, it's all rigged, it's vote by mail, because we hear a lot of that right now on the talk radio waves. Dan Fagan, Suzanne Downing, Mike Porcaro. It's all a fix.
A couple things first. I mean, I think,
but it's a Republican administration who's doing this.
Right, and I'll say one thing from the get-go that I think everyone would agree with. Hats off to Kevin Meyer for catching this whole situation on one bounce and putting a plan together. It's a best-in-class. We have to do it all by mail. We're going to pay postage. They're meeting every Alaskan where they are. So every Alaskan is going to have that equal chance. They're mailing out ballots early, so rural people aren't going to be disenfranchised by slow mail. So I'll start by saying they're doing it the right way. Now, what's weird to me on the whole vote by mail thing is everyone knows historically, at least in Alaska, conservatives dominated absentee. Like they did forever, and then this tectonic shift has happened in 2020 where voting by mail is fake. Republicans used to do it. I mean, the Republican Party would send out an absentee mailer to every single Republican voter.
Florida, who's often votes Republicans, has done massive absentee voting for years because they have an elderly population.
Right,
and it's worked. It's worked.
And
fine.
I think candidates, however conservative they are, talk bad about vote by mail at their peril. If you tell people it's rigged and tell people their vote's not going to count, guess what they're going to not do? They're not going to vote.
That's the catch-22 of saying it's rigged. Right?
But it's super secure. We've done it for years. Many states do it. There's never been widespread fraud, and there's a loud element, but I think it's a very small element that's very loud about this.
What do you think, Matt, about how the Republicans kind of strategy?
Well, I'll say I think from a strategy perspective, like if you're running a campaign, there's some advantage of having the numbers come in. You see the ballots that are returned. You actually get a lot of data of people that are returning their ballots. You can chase them by phone, by mail.
And you can narrow your focus on the people who haven't voted yet.
So, and people who have returned their ballots, and whether it's early on, the communication usually dries up and they focus it on people who haven't. So that, I would say from a campaign perspective, if you're a campaign consultant or a manager, that there is advantages there. I will say, like, there are people, like even in the municipal election, I was trying to figure out, like, what's the sentiment? What are you feeling? And I think they'll talk about it a little bit more. My advice is they need to, if they have a concern, they need to, as we do in any place, we need to cite the concern, make a formal complaint, and do it through the proper channels. But again, anecdotally, I've heard from some people who just said, I didn't get a ballot in the mail, or I didn't get it till the last few days, and that sometimes happens. We know that the mail here is slow and it's not necessarily always reliable. But I think, and that's one of the things I would say, is having people understanding what is the alternative if your ballot doesn't show up. What are your options?
So the campaigns with the most sophisticated or savvy campaign managers or campaign staff are going to have a huge advantage of knowing who voted, who to target. Already there's that kind of data-driven campaigning where you kind of go for your
this is kind of lifting the veil on politics and campaigns, but data is the crux of your campaign. It's who are your targets. I mean, we can pull the voter roll. We can see everyone who's returning, who in previous it's whoever received a ballot by absentee request, who's returning it, when they're returning it. You can get daily updates from the division saying these ballots came in on this day, and you take them from a not voted to a voted. You stop calling them, and you start moving your resources to the dwindling kind of piece of the pie of people who haven't voted yet.
Yeah, what's different here is, of course, instead of chasing 150,000 ballot universe, it's 580,000 ballots. So, the target is much wider, but of course you start with people who have a high propensity to vote, and you move your way over. But I think you're right. Like, the most sophisticated campaigns are going to just have an advantage. They're going to time their mail with the ballots. They're going to shift their focus.
I've worked on campaigns, and it's the absentee chase is very, very, very standard. You send out your, when the absentee ballots go out, so you send out your mail to people, receive them at the same time or the day after, so they can get
I was
activated to.
I was talking to a campaign in Colorado from last year, and they talk about numbers that how many touches you have with a individual to kind of move them along to your on behalf of your candidate. And we call it propensity, the propensity of your contact. And I mean, I'll tell you what, get ready, because the numbers get bigger and bigger each year. It used to be 8, 9, now it's like 14 or 16. And that's how many reaches or contacts do you have to make?
Phone call,
phone calls,
knock,
digital
piece of
communication.
mail.
Yeah.
Well, if you're a U or an N in Alaska right now, there could potentially be 8 or 9.
Undeclared or nonpartisan.
Yeah, and eight or 9 candidates trying to contact you again and again because they don't know how you're going to vote in this field.
Yeah.
So get ready to get buried in polls, phones, knocks.
We talked about
mailers.
before. There's no Democrat yet in the U.S. Senate race, but there's several here on the special election. There's Adam Wool. There's Chris Constant from the Assembly. There's I got to pull up can you think of it?
Well,
There's
I'll
more.
say this. Right. I'm inclined to believe, Lindsey Kavanaugh with the Democratic Party, in her statement when LV got out of the race, was we will have a candidate. We're just not ready to announce them yet.
Yeah, and I think they will.
And so do we know? Do they have a candidate yet? Maybe not, but I think they're trying. I think they think it's important. And just like if the Republican, it was inverse, the Republicans would think it was important to put up a candidate to talk about the platform.
Of course,
and
they
virtues,
should have somebody on. I'm just saying in the Senate race we have none. We had one. Now we have.
Well, you have to remember that insiders were talking about LV since last September or so. So she's been taking all the oxygen. Everyone else is like, oh, LV's running, and she's a strong candidate.
Yeah.
She's well known, well liked, very smart, very charismatic. And so, much like the Don Young race, no one was thinking about it.
The question I wanted to ask was with Chris Constant, and you got Mary Peltola, and you got Adam Wool, and there's several others. They're going to be competing for the Democratic votes, right? But there's only so many Democrats in the state. What does that do to the Democrats' ability to get one or two, one person on the top 4?
What's going to be interesting in this race is...
And Al Gross is going to be going for those votes too.
Right. I mean, it's going to be a feature of ballot measure 2, which is people are going to think outside their normal lanes. They're going to think about who's good on fish issues, who cares about the geographic region that I live in. There's going to be, I think voters are going to align and identify themselves, or if you're a Josh Revak fan, he's a vet, I identify with that. So I think, everyone's kind of got a lane to activate. It's going to be fascinating. I mean, to me, and this is just as totally as an observer, I'm kind of curious, who is Al Gross going to go after? There's Democrats in the race. He's used to running sort of as the nominal Democrat plus. Where does he go? There's some real obvious associations for some of them, but some people they're in, and you sort of wonder. Adam Wool, he's Fairbanks. Yeah. So you got the Fairbanks Democrats have him, the Fairbanks Republicans have John Coghill.
Well, I'll say I asked a couple folks, just said, hey, what are your hot takes on this race? So these aren't necessarily all my thoughts, but there's a couple folks, someone highlighted, what does labor do? Labor's a big tent, and right. We know there's the building trades, there's the Teamsters, there's the laborers, there are operating engineers that generally support center-right candidates, and then there's the other end of that spectrum that kind of supports center-left. And where do they go, and what do they do? What kind of candidate do they get behind? Because there's a general thought. People like to pick winners, but they also like to pick winners that are that are close enough to their belief system. So,
well, I think labor and all these big groups and everybody, I imagine, are just going to stay out of the primary. They're just going to stay out of it because it's such a
You'd think so.
Unknown situation.
I mean, here's my thing. Even if you're thinking about getting in the primary, you're probably going to miss your window if you're not already working now. I mean, that's the thing. If people who are thinking about getting involved, this is moving very, very fast. The other question is, we talked about lanes. Someone brought up, it's who consumes in this congressional race, who consumes the far kind of more conservative, some would say far right lane. I mean, is that Nick Begich, he's been fighting for that lane since he started running against the congressman, or is that Sarah? And we just don't know. I think that Nick and his team have been focused for many months on occupying that space, and then so starting right and trying to build to the center. And we'll have to see. And what often gets raised on these conversations is the people who go and toast a beer and have some hors d'oeuvres at a fundraiser don't reflect a groundswell or grassroots, and that's the difference maker. I mean, we've seen it in elections across the state, is that just because you can put together a good fundraising list doesn't necessarily mean you will have the groundswell that goes and votes for you.
I mean, there's a guy I forget his name, but there was a guy in New Jersey the truck driver who raised no money, who almost beat the incumbent governor
Right.
last time.
Which you'd take as a votes against, someone. But I think, what's going to be
But
fascinating.
still, I
is-
mean, that's true. But also, he was, it would shock a lot of people because they weren't paying attention.
Right. What's fascinating to me is, are voters going to be paying attention to, I think the system's set up, everyone gets to vote their favorite. And if you can't find out of 48 people someone you identify with, I don't know how to help you, because it's
Yeah.
a diverse group, right? But who are the high ceiling candidate or high floor candidates who are going to get in that top 4 but low ceiling, right? And by which I mean, if you've got 25% of the electorate that will
So
run
you get
through
high floor, low. What do you mean high floor, low
ceiling.
How do
So
mean by
you
that?
got 25% of the electorate that will walk through a wall for you, and so you're definitely in that top 4. But everyone else hates you. You're not getting a second ranking from anyone. Like, in a nutshell, who can recreate the Don Young magic? Why did Don Young win again and again and again? I mean, colorful, hardworking, all those things. But when you think about it, he's a guy who was very bipartisan and yet could fend off Republican challenges. He was a guy who was a Republican but had extraordinarily warm relationships with labor and Alaska Native communities. If the person who can pull out of the most silos has an enormous advantage when they get to that ranked choice part. I think if Don Young had ever run an election or this, I think he would have, to be honest, I think he could have won in the final tabulation 60-40, 70-30, just because so many people, he's not my first choice, but you know what? He delivered. He delivered this sewer and water project.
Well, I think
He
this
delivered
is probably the Lisa Murkowski path. Is she's going to be so many people's first choice, but she's going to be a lot of people's second choice. And this is, I think, probably the thought process, at least from my end, on her path to victory is a lot of second place votes.
It rewards someone who can build a coalition, who just doesn't say, I'm a base politician, this is my base, and I'll ride or die on every issue for this group of people. It's a person who says, pragmatically, I represent everyone, I got to talk to everyone. And I think Don Young, quietly, colorful as he was, he did that. I mean, I know a lot of people in labor love the guy. A lot of people in the Alaska Native community, rural Alaska, of course, love the guy. That's what's different. I mean, in some races you see rural Alaska go wildly Democratic, and then you see Joe Biden winning these rural districts, and then you see Don Young winning them the other direction, 30 points. The only way you do that is to be that kind of person.
Well, look, I was helping the congressman on his race, and we spent a lot of time looking at vote totals and where you're successful. We also did a big diagnostic on Senator Sullivan's race, and I want to flag something there. Senator Sullivan, under the old model, he won 27 of 40 legislative districts in 2020, which is really, I mean, if you think about it, Donald Trump won 21, Don Young won 22. That's a pretty big, to pick up that many legislative districts is a big thing. And, the senator won Anchorage. So I think that the senator, people view him as a conservative because he is, but he's also a big tent, and he also is a talk-to and pragmatic guy that people disagree with him on the left and the right, but at the end of the day, he kind of has carved out this.
Yeah, I mean, some of the Anchorage districts, Sullivan outperformed. He beat Gross by huge amounts of votes. Whereas other ones it was a lot closer. So
Yeah.
last thing I want to talk about is this proposed constitutional convention, which is starting to get a little more talk. Matt, you're involved. You're helping out a group that's defend the Constitution. It's against the constitutional.
Defend our constitutions. The group's name.
So we have this on the ballot every 10 years. I went back and checked. In 1992, it failed 37 to 62, so 2-1. 2002, 28 to 71%, so 70-30. And then in 2012, it was 33 to 66. So it's always basically 2-1 against, which tells me the floor on this thing is 30%, 35%. People are going to vote for it every time. So it's not getting 51%. It's getting an additional 15 or 16% from people that are always going to vote for it. So it's been talked about more and more by some legislators. Senator Showers talked about it. Representative McCabe's talked about it. There's so many issues with the dividend, the judicial selection. A lot of conservatives don't like private property rights, abortion rights. I believe this is going to be. In the past, it's never really been pushed by any groups.
Yeah.
But I think this year is going to be different. I want to start with you, Matt.
Yeah. Well, full disclosure, I like I said, I'm doing work with the group Defend Our Constitution. There's an op-ed in the Anchorage Daily News today with the co-chairs of that. It's a bipartisan group.
Name some of them. It's Kathy Giesel, John Coghill, Bruce Patello, Joel Hall.
Yep, it's like I said, it's a big group. It's Rep. Edgman, it's it's a big growing group, but it's the co-chairs are one part of it, but there's a coalition which is over 150 people. So I encourage you to go look on the website defendakconstitution.com. And look, I'll tell you what, I was asked to join this in part because I think in growing a bipartisan coalition, I wanted to look at what the issue had to deal with. I went back and looked at people that I respected who have weighed in on this on the no side, and I kind of came to the ultimate conclusion that I didn't think that this would be the right way to make changes. And there's people who are part of the coalition who are pro-life, who want to see changes to the way that we select judges, who want to see changes into perhaps our education system. There's a variety of people who want to see targeted changes, but the one thing that everyone agrees on is it's the process in which you do it. And the question is, the Constitutional Convention, which gets asked every 10 years, is do we essentially open up the Constitution for wholesale change, that the plenary powers that are afforded to the delegates would allow them to essentially open up the whole Constitution, and it'd be a long, drawn-out process. There'd be an election. It would take place over 3 or 4 or 6 years. It would be this process, and I'll tell you, if I can make one point about it, is that level of uncertainty, 3, 4, or 5 years, which puts every sort of piece of language in our Constitution up for change, that can be taxing authority, that can be issues dealing with our resources and our lands. That's just not good for business. That's not good for certainty, and the chilling effect it would have on investment would not be good. So
yeah, I mean the point Matt makes. I mean, I want to highlight the word plenary, which doesn't mean a lot to most people. What that means is we literally take our existing Constitution, and it's in the shredder. And everything short of a monarchy is on the table.
It's important to highlight. Just it's like you said, take it out, throw it in the garbage, start from scratch.
Right.
It's just a total
start
from scratch.
Do I think that's going to happen? No, I think that and I think the proponents are going to say, no, that's not going to happen. So I'm not saying that it is going to happen, but it can happen. And I think what we recognize is that we have had a lot of acrimony in our state for the last 10 years where we've been fighting. People are tired of politics for a lot of these reasons. And I think that there's a lot of people who think, our next 5 or 6 years, regardless of who's governor, regardless who has control of the legislature, we should be thinking about the opportunities that we have. We have an opportunity to make a good thing out of a bad situation that's happening in in terms of our revenues and the things that have been decided on over recent years. I think there's a lot of people who'll say, let's focus on the good and the optimistic rather than the infighting.
Scott, if this thing were to, and I think it's probably not super likely, but I think it's got a better shot than it ever has this time.
Well, no one's ever really weaponized it before, and it's being weaponized.
Correct. That's why I think it's going to have more votes than before. But I mean, like Matt said, it's 3 or 4. You have to have an election, elect delegates. You have to go to the convention. You have to draw it up. Then you have to have the people approve it, right? So how crazy would it get if this were to happen?
I mean, how crazy does the legislature get, right? Because if we elect 65,
I think it's times 10.
If we elect 65 people, the product is going to be as good as their collective work. I mean, and you can't exaggerate the level of uncertainty that would be injected, because what people don't understand is, we'll change a couple things, we'll elect judges instead. Every statute has its root in the Constitution. Every regulation has its root in a statute. If you bring down the Constitution, every statute that conflicts with the new version is out, like resource development, education, taxes, how you do business, how you get a building permit, like everything. You have the possibility of literally disrupting everything about your way of life, whether it comes from something as small as your individual rights, your individual privacy rights, all the way up to how we develop resources on the North Slope. All of a sudden, it's a whole new regime.
So you guys are both no votes.
100% a no.
Well, I'll say this. It's that there's a number of states who have this built into their Constitution every 10 years, every 20 years, but it hasn't been done across the country for over 20 years. I think Hawaii did it. But the point that I'm making is that I think that this is going to energize national groups. If that we move towards a constitutional convention, they're going to say, is this
100%.
Is this a model for us to do something in our state? Alaska is kind of a cheap date when it comes to campaigns. Should we invest $10, $20 million just to see what happens? And can we push our priorities? And I'll say, that kind of makes me nervous, because they're going to gamble and see if it's worth the investment on a variety of issues, and that can be.
It's the perfect incubator, and that's why I think there's going to be a lot of support to vote for this thing. this summer,
wherever
and this fall. I think a lot of groups are going to come out and say, "Wow, if we can get this thing passed, wow, we can have a whole."
But wherever you sit, there's something to fear, right? So if you say you're a big resource, I'm a fan of resource development. It's raised life expectancies. It's brought wealth to the states, built the permanent fund. But what if we get, as this process goes, it's not like it happens quietly somewhere where no one can have impact on it. What if lower 48 groups are putting tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars trying to just basically say, we're going to lock up Alaska. We're going to put in the Constitution, we're going to constitutionalize preservation of 95% of their lands.
Oh, sure. There's huge risks.
And you could go the other way, right?
Sure.
You could say we're gonna not only take away a woman's right to choose, we're gonna make sure it's not in the Constitution. I mean,
and I'll say this: even after all that is done, and the delegates propose a constitution, new constitution, and it has to go again to the people to vote, to accept it. Excuse me. And
Ring.
and there's no certainty that this even does anything. That we can go through this multi-year process, and I think, look, everyone has a different position. There's some who say this is an exercise that, if there's changes, people should be making these or proposing these down in Juneau to even begin the conversation. There's proposals.
Well, they've tried many constitutional amendments. The governor's tried them, and they just don't go anywhere.
But
I think the argument to that as well.
Well, there should be a threshold, right? Right now we have a process where 2/3 of each body, then it goes to the voters. Where this would be an all or nothing goes to the voters, and 50% plus one wins. I mean, we could on any given day.
I do want to say, if this thing happens, I will be running for delegate. So just putting it out
see,
there.
now
that should terrify people.
Now the no vote just went up 5 points.
So the way it works is, it says it's like pretty. It's got to be similar to the number of delegates, and 55. But I think it would be the population's increase. So I was guessing, let's say 2 per district, right? 2 per house. So you have 80 delegates.
The conventional wisdom is that it's going to be approximately 65. So 60 representatives that represent our Senate and our House, and then 5 at large. And that.
Where'd that come from?
That's based on the previous language, and I can get you the language. That's what the general consensus has been. The legislature will have to ultimately approve how delegates are elected.
They set the election date. I think it's the next general election, unless they choose a quicker special.
And they have to fund the process and all of that. So you're setting yourself up for a 6-year battle of an unknown scale and
multi-year. I mean, we don't know how long, but multi-year, and so we'll see what happens. But I think the Defend Our Constitution group is a growing group. I think you're going to see growing coalitions that understand that this has implications, that for every issue there is to win on, there's 10 times more to lose on, regardless of your political affiliation, your background, your geography. And I think that you're going to see this coalition grow to include a number of resource development folks in the resource development community, the business community, all across the board. So this is a growing group, and I've been asked why now. It seems earlier people talking about this. I think just being prepared is important.
Definitely the average voter this is not on the radar of 95% of people, but I think it will be in the months to come.
No, I mean, and I think it's going to unite strange bedfellows. I mean, you're going to see people on the left, the right, development, pro-development, anti-development. I mean, it could have a real unifying effect because I think everyone understands, you have to have rules, you have to set the table, and then we have spirited debates around those rules. But again, if you get rid of the Constitution...
It's like Vladimir Putin, it really unify people sometimes.
Hey, I know we're probably wrapping up here soon.
We are, yeah.
What was your conversation like with Lisa Murkowski and Joe Manchin the other day?
That was a great conversation. I put it up on the podcast, and then also I just posted it on the YouTube channel and Facebook page. So it was really good. They were at the Arctic Encounter event at the Nina Center.
So we're following that? This is a big...
You guys are following Joe Manchin and Lisa Murkowski.
This is a big downgrade.
And I got to say
I apologize.
Watch it on our YouTube channel or Facebook page, but one of my favorite parts was when Joe Manchin was talking about West Virginia moonshine, and a friend of his that makes it, that he tried to get legal because he was giving it away, and he convinced him to make it legal, and he couldn't think of a name, and he said, "What do you guys call it?" And he's like, "We call it farm fuel." And he said they actually use it to power farm equipment. Yeah. They're drinking this shit. But great conversation. Check it out. We talked about all kinds of things happening in D.C. and the recent vote for Ketanji Brown Jackson and the ANWR and the resource development, and it was really, really great. You were there. You kind of saw it, so really good conversation. Yeah. Well, I want to thank both of you guys, Matt Shuckerow and Scott Kendall, for being here and talking. The months to come, there's going to be so much to talk about, and I hope to have you guys back here again. There's going to be some big elections and some big money. And again, folks, if you want to advertise your cause, for your cause, against somebody else's cause, get a hold of me. We sell ads. We're going to be doing more of these shows. We have the website, so we appreciate your support in advertising and supporting us. And I want to thank GCI again for being such a great sponsor and making shows like this possible. We'll be doing a lot more of these shows as the election season progresses, at least once a week, and hopefully more than that. I want to thank Scott Jensen for helping put the show together, Trent McNally for producing it and doing all the background work with the audio video. It's a big help. So stay tuned for the next show. And again, I want to thank Matt and Scott for coming here and being with me today for the election talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
That's pretty good.